So we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Ted Jackson. I'm the Community Organizing Consultant at CFILC and the DOnetwork, and I will be doing our training today, and I'm really happy to be here with everyone. So we're going to jump right in, and we're going to talk about some definitions. And definitions are important for us to get a common understanding of and a foundation of the work that we're going to be talking about today. And we may open up some discussion at the end of these definitions, so be prepared to do some discussion and Q&A fairly early on in this webinar. The first one is agency, and that's a word I think that we hear a lot in today's world. People talk about their agency or having their agency, and agency is the capacity of an entity, a person, or another entity, like a human being or any living being in general, or soul consciousness and religion, to act in any given environment. So it's your ability to make a choice or to do something in whatever environment that you're in. The example is making a choice without interference from outside persuasion. So no matter what the environment is that you're in. The next word that we're going to talk about is intentional. This is a really important word for us to kind of start to get into our vocabulary and to start to understand, because things don't happen unless we do them intentionally. And intentional basically means done with purpose, or it's deliberate. So an example might be waiting to release an agenda, a statement, or hold an event until the right stakeholders are involved. So being intentional about living out our values or our principles in the work that we do. The next word is a word that we are very common with, and that is the word coalition. I think we all of us work in a lot of different coalitions. And a coalition is simply an organization of organizations united around a common issue or a clear goal or several goals. So some examples for us in California are the California In-Home Support Services Consumer Alliance, that we commonly call CICA, and the Disability Action Coalition. And hold on to this one, because when we get to the discussion part, I'm probably going to be asking folks about what coalitions they work with. The next definition is another word that we use a lot, and that's issue. We talk about issues a lot in the community organizing work and the political advocacy work that we do. And an issue communicates what you're fighting for to help solve your problems. It is the answer oftentimes to the barrier that is in front of you. And an issue is what activist organizations focus on. So oftentimes issues affect people, but we're focused on people through the issue that we're trying to change or to promote. So issues could be saving healthcare, election accessibility, stopping school bullying. There's a wide range of issues that we work on. Intersectionality is our next definition that I want to talk about. And after we're done with this one, then we're going to open up the phones for a little discussion on these words and definitions. So intersectionality is a fairly new word. I think that it's a lot like intentional and agency. It's a word that we hear a lot. I've been hearing the word intentional for about 20 years, agency for about 10, but really in the last 5 or 6 years, the word intersectional or intersectionality has been really bandied about, being used by a lot of activists, especially in the disability community. And it's the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So it's really, in a nutshell, how we identify with multiple different groups. So for myself, I identify as an LGBTQ person, and as a disabled person. So I have an intersection there, and it's those common things. My intersections are those common things that affect me both as a queer person and affect me as a disabled person. And so some examples of how this plays out for us, the biggest example for how this plays out for us in community organizing is trying to do work and to reach out to the unserved and underrepresented communities that are listed in the California State Independent Living Council's State Plan for Independent Living. So for those of us who work at independent living centers or funded within the DOnetwork, this is really, really important that we're doing intersectional work and that we're finding those connections that connect those common issues that are impactful both on people with disabilities and on African American people, or people with disabilities and queer people, or people with disabilities and youth, people with disabilities and Native Americans, etc. So I want to open up the lines right now. So press *6 to unmute your phone. And we're going to do a little bit of discussion time right now on these definitions. And then, of course, if you're on the webinar system, you can press the talk button to talk. So the first question I want to ask folks is, can someone talk about their own intersectionality or how intersectionality has played a part in the work or advocacy they do? So I know that Cindy Calderon is on. Cindy, do you want to talk about some of the work that you've done reaching out to Native Americans in Northern California and the Eureka area?
Okay, well, my mind was on the intersectionality, and I guess I'd first identify as a Caucasian senior. Those are two things, I guess. And yes, the Native American outreach really needs to be led by them. We're very careful in not waiting for them to ask us, but we don't arrive at the reservation as here we are. You know, we ask if we can, and then we follow. For example, they always have a lot of food at meetings. So we design our workshops or whatever around things that they usually do within their own community. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. What are some of the issues that you have found that are issues that impact both people with disabilities and impact the Native American population in your community that can bring you together?
Definitely both are underserved, and for the Native American, it's a little bit different because they have their social services on their reservations and their things of that nature. So we just try to be with them as much as we can and offer what they tell us they want. Sometimes I don't think there is a lot, at least locally, of the pride, disability pride, when it's hard to get to people that are way up there.
Okay, cool. And are there common barriers? Are there other barriers that, you know, for example, it might be a barrier to transportation? So when I talk about issues like, is there a common barrier that people with disabilities are experiencing and the Native American population are experiencing, and both communities kind of go, aha, we could be working on that together? Are there issues like that, and if so, what are they?
Yes, absolutely. It was the community that got their own public transportation running back and forth from, I'll call it a city, the main hub, back to the reservation and even far beyond. So definitely there was some collaboration in designing the hookup times. But the transportation at our local reservations is really hard. I mean, it might be a couple times a day only. we think that we have it hard here in northern Humboldt, but in eastern Humboldt, it's like the problem's tenfold.
Awesome.
And really
awesome that you identified that. So in the chat box, folks, we just have a couple of comments. Jake has talked about that Jake is Jewish, LGBTQ, and has a disability, so there's some intersections there. And Yolanda, who's the youth advocate at CFILC, talks about being queer, Latinx, and multiply disabled woman. So there's a lot of intersections there. So let's go to coalitions right now. You know, we use as examples on this slide California In-Home Support Services Consumer Alliance and Disability Action Coalition. But could folks tell us the names of some of the coalitions that that you're working with?
Hi, this is Cindy again. We are working with a local coalition called Safe Streets.
Oh, that's great.
And we focus together on the main part. Yeah.
Great. I see that we have Charity with us from Fresno, Elizabeth from Orange County, Yolanda from CFILC in Sacramento, Maria from Cecil in the Central Coast, Mario is with us from the Inland Empire. Do any of you want to mention some of the coalitions that you work with? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move along. We're going to talk a little bit about being intentional. I'm trying to get to the right slide here. And intentionality, or being intentional. We'd really like to have, I know Cindy has spoken twice, if other folks could jump on and speak, that would be great. I would like to get some examples of people's experience working intentionally, making a decision to do something a certain way so that more people are included. There's someone who can give an example of that? Cindy Calderon, do you have any examples of how you've worked intentionally? I see a lot of people typing into the chat box, but we really want folks to speak up.
Okay, I'm going to tap. Okay.
So Elizabeth asked me to repeat the question, saying, you know, if you can give some examples of how you've made the choice to work a certain way or to do things a certain way so that other people are included in the work.
Hey Ted, this is Yolanda. I just wanted to speak on possibly, you know, working with intention. That starts from the very beginning of planning and making sure that you're really reaching out to the right people. You know, when you send information about your event or your cause, make sure that you have multiply marginalized people, such as, you know, contacts from the queer community, contacts that involve people of color, that reach out to lower socioeconomic groups. And you can find that in multiple ways, whether it's reaching out through, you know, the benefits that they receive or programs that they take a part of, or just looking at other resources that your consumers use.
That's a really great example. And I love the fact that we're hearing from a youth advocate right now talking about taking those steps to be inclusive. Thank you, Yolanda. And so we have some comments here also that I'm going to read before we move on from Charity in Fresno, talking about thinking strategically on timing of an email blast is a good example. And then also Cindy Calderon in Eureka says, actions, for example, we have a Christmas card design competition with our local art studio staffed by members of the developmentally disabled community. And then it's chosen and released and released, announced via media in our Facebook page. So they, they specifically want to include a specific community in this project. So those are really, really great examples. So we're going to go ahead and move on. And Yolanda, I'm so glad you brought up that example, because that is exactly what we're going to talk about as we move into our strategy. So we've set a base or a foundation with a discussion on some basic principles and definitions of this type of work to include folks and to start building our strategy and our messaging to bring folks in. So for the rest of the webinar, the next phase is strategy, and then we're going to talk about how we develop those messages to implement the strategy to start bringing more folks in. And of course, we'll have time for Q&A. So on this slide, we have two triangles. One is a triangle that is the point of the triangle, the orientation is upward. And on the second triangle, the orientation is pointed downwards. And this is what I call the timeline triangle with strategy. The first one, where the pyramid is pointing upwards, is our typical strategy. If we're to think about a pyramid scheme or a pyramid system of the way we plan events, we start with planning, we then do outreach, and then we get participation. And what's interesting about that is if we apply it to the pyramid, we see that we start with a small group of people doing the planning. And that group of people, whoever's doing the planning, is making the decisions, right? So if we have a small group of people making the decisions, we have to ask ourselves, how many people or how many voices are in that decision-making process that are going to be served by the program itself. The next thing we do is we've already set a plan together, and then we do outreach. And the barrier that we come across there is if we have a plan that's devised by 3 or 4 people, but now we're outreaching to a wide range of folks, that plan may not fit the needs, and therefore our outreach becomes extra hard. We have to double up our efforts on our outreach because we weren't thinking about how the message or how the program fits this person over here who has the intersection of this and that, or we weren't figuring out how it works for this person over here who has a different viewpoint than we do. And then we get to participation after our outreach. And sometimes the participation can be great, but sometimes the participation is lower than what we want. Because from the very beginning, we started our pyramid with a small group of people and then tried to grow it. So what I like to think of is turning the pyramid upside down, the triangle upside down for an inclusive model. And the very first thing is to start with the outreach. So if we're going to do a program, if we're going to do an event, if we're going to do something, the very first thing is doing the outreach so that we can make sure that we have enough people that check our different boxes or that have our different lived experiences around the table to speak for the widest range of communities that are affected by the problem or the barrier. So they all can add their viewpoint of what is needed to break that barrier or what is needed to really address that issue that will be accepting to their community and that will mobilize their community. The next piece is participation. We get all those groups of people together, we get them participating with one another, and then finally we go to the planning. And this is when we're going to plan the event, or this is how we're going to plan everything because we've gotten the participation of a wider range of people. The best example in California that I know of this over the years has been the Disability Action Coalition that puts on Disability Capital Action Day. Not everyone attends every meeting, I used to help staff putting DCAD together. Christina has done it many times. I know there's members of the DOnetwork who are even on this webinar that are a part of putting that coalition together. And that coalition is pretty broad. I think it can still grow, but at different points in time, there have been anywhere from 40 to 50 groups that have been involved with this, so that we're constantly looking around, seeing how many more people can we touch with the work we do on Disability Capital Action Day. And then that group comes together and they participate together in planning for about 6 or 7 months. It's a pretty long time. And again, not everyone's at every meeting, but there's a wide range of groups and different types of people with different types of lived experiences that are involved with putting that together. And then they set forth with the planning of it, and they put on a great event. Super. So now we're going to move on to the next slide of our strategy. So we've talked about turning our pyramid upside down and making sure that we're looking at it from a different angle in starting with our outreach. And now we have to further our strategy. Now that we've decided to do that, we got to get the other people there, right? We got to do the outreach piece of it. And so on this slide, there's 2 ovals. And the 2 ovals are overlapping with one another, and each of them represents a community. And the one that has a 1 in the middle of it represents you and your community. The other oval that represents that has a 2 in it represents another community that you want to have at the table. You want to have a relationship with that community. And so in the area where they overlap, there's a 3. And that 3 is that person or community that identifies with both. And that's your intersection. And so in the strategy that we're going to lay out today, you want to engage that person or that organization or that group that has that intersection that can be a bridge for you and bring you all together. And we're going to talk about this strategy kind of in terms of a dinner party. Just because it's kind of fun and it's interesting, but people who host dinner parties do this very work. They bring people together for conversation, they bring people together for fun, but they bring people together for interaction. And on this slide there is a picture of a dinner party. It's a table fully set with food on it and plates, and you see a lot of different multicultural people around the table toasting each other and smiling and having conversation. So the first question that we want to ask ourselves after we have made the priority to do the outreach first, then we've identified who our bridge person is that's going to bring the other community in, that's the intersection. Next we want to ask who is at our table. And so the roles that we have in this at our table, and our table could be is sort of an analogy for our first meeting with these other communities or with these other folks that we want to work with. And the number 1 is you and your identity, and having a real strong sense of who you are and what your goals are and what your issues are. It's really important. It's really important for everyone at the table is that you have a strong sense of what your mission is and what you're working on. But sometimes we don't always align. The next is the guests, everyone else at the table. And, they're going to have their strong sense, but now we need to listen. That's the next thing, is to listen to their identity and to listen for what their strong sense of their identity is. What are their barriers? What are their issues? And the role of the host in all of this, that's the number 3, that's the intersectional person that you're going to ask to bring you all together, is someone that identifies with both and that can really start asking the right questions and bringing people together and help you identify what those issues are that bind you together. So, for example, if you wanted to bring caregivers together with people with disabilities, that intermediary, that host might be a family member of a person with a disability, might be someone that understands both sides of issues that brings people together and understands what folks might have in common with one another so that they can work together. So now let's talk about, once you've got everyone together, you have a strong sense of your own identity and a strong sense of your mission and why you're coming to the table. You've taken the opportunity to listen to the other guests and their strong sense of their identity and their mission, and you've sat back and let the host guide the process and bring everyone together. Now you got to dive into the conversation. And I kind of advanced onto this a little bit in the previous slide, but the conversation is really about issues. And your host organization or your intermediary is going to be responsible for those conversation starters. So when you first identify that person, when you first identify, shucks, I want to work with the Native American population in my catchment area or in my region, and I found someone that is a member of a particular tribe who is also a person with a disability, you're going to ask that person to host the first meeting, and you're going to ask them to come up with some conversation starters and to come up with a platform or an agenda that brings us all together, that gets us talking to one another. And on this slide, we have a picture of some people standing on a beach. They appear to be young people, and they're all huddled up together, and they're holding a beach ball that is a globe of the Earth. So after we've got all of these folks together and we started this conversation, we do need to be asking ourselves, how is our table accessible for everyone? So just like a dinner party, we want to make sure that we have the right utensils for everyone to eat. We have the right utensils that match the food. Some people might say you got to have the right glass for the right drink and the right plate for the right food. We have to make sure that our table is accessible for everyone. So, what are your utensils? For us in the disability community, that might be accommodations. That might be clear path of travel. It might be communication access. But it could also be cultural. I think for us, when we're reaching out to other communities, we have to be aware of that, especially with the other guests. What are their utensils? A lot of that could be very, very cultural. You don't sometimes want to meet in the wrong place. Sometimes it could be the time of day. I'm putting together a meeting in a couple of weeks in San Francisco right now to introduce some folks in different political communities to the disability community. And one of the things that was really interesting was the people that we're working with in the political community do a lot of these morning breakfasts, right? Or they do morning coffees. And so they first said, well, can we meet at 7 a.m.? And we said no, and then they said, can we meet at 8 a.m.? And so now we're meeting at 11 a.m. And it took us some time to get them to understand that culturally, getting a large number of people with disabilities out in a metro downtown area was really not going to happen at 7 o'clock in the morning. And we had to do some education about care providers coming to the house, getting people ready, getting them dressed, and then education on how long it takes to get there by public transportation. So we really forced, in an intentional way, our friends on the political side to understand the cultural and tangible realities of getting people with disabilities together, so that they had to understand the disability culture. And a friend of mine and I were the hosts. We're the in-between, the intermediaries. And with some of the people with disabilities, we've had to spend some time talking with them, saying, this is going to be not a protest, not a rally. This is a sit-down, talk, exchange of ideas, and bringing people together. So we had to explain to them that, the politicians and the people who are interested in having this conversation are also folks that culturally, in their world, are afraid of things splashing all over the media. And so it puts them on edge a little bit. So we had to explain that culture to those folks and bringing those people together and finding the right match for folks. So can anyone, I just want to stop here for a moment and see if anyone, and you can unmute your phone by pressing *6 or pressing the mute button again, or press the talk button on the webinar system. We prefer that people speak up if you can instead of using the chat box. But can anyone talk about any of their experiences using any of these techniques? Mario's got his hand raised.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I can't hear me, but I'm glad you can. I've been involved with Disability Capital Action Day since 2014, and I feel that's probably one of our biggest events for all independent living centers that we have going. But each year, it's run by a dozen people. We have a board of 5 people, and then there might be another half a dozen folks from the outside that help us with fundraising, resource fair, and things of that nature. I don't understand why there isn't more involvement with this, because like I say, it's one of our biggest events. It's one of the biggest cross-intersectionality events that we have each year, and the involvement is really key. If you want to start learning how this process works, just get involved. My first year, I jumped in and I helped organize the DOnetwork booth up there, the different times, scheduling the times when we were going to be there from 8 to 10 and 10 to 12 and that type of stuff, just to get my feet wet and to get started. And that was enough to get me so involved with that now it's my 4th year. I'm on the board. I do the financial stuff along with fundraising, also the resource fair. You'll see me up on the stage, all that kind of stuff now. And I'd like to see a little more involvement. People need to understand that Disability Capital Action Day is the biggest thing that we do out there. And hopefully this year it'll be even better because we changed the venue. We now know where we're going to be, and we're hoping we're going to go from the 1,000 that we had last year back up to 2,000 to 2,500 that we normally have. But that's how I got started in it, and that taught me a lot of stuff from the beginning, how to just get things involved, and then the fundraising part of it, the resource part of it, and getting the outreach done there too. But I think I'd like to see a little more involvement. We've been planning this. We started planning this year in early October. The executive board got together in October. We have a meeting every 2 weeks now. In January, we're really going to hit the ground running. The save the date has already gone out. It's already on the website. People can register for their booze. They can register for booze already, but that hasn't even been publicized, but we have it in place, ready to go. So we've learned year after year what will make it better, what will make it bigger, but involvement is key, and we just don't have the involvement we like, and it just takes a little bit of time from everybody to really make this a big deal. I'm done talking.
Yeah, so Mario, I think you bring up something that's really good. You know, one of the interesting things is I know that years ago when DCAD was a much larger thing, there were about 40, sometimes 50 groups that were in the Disability Action Coalition. And there was sort of a looser organization. I know now that there are officers and a board and stuff like that, and I think that was important for some reasons as the organization grew. But do folks still work in work groups? Like, are there folks who aren't on the board or groups that aren't on the board who are helping with fundraising or helping with this area or that area?
That's where we're lacking. That's where we have a lacking. A lot of the board members are still head of this fundraising, head of the outreach, head of everything is done by the board members. We may have 6 other coalition members that help out kind of spattering, but it's just not there yet. It would make it much easier on the board itself to focus on board stuff, but we have to spend so much time picking up the pieces and making everything else work, along with the folks up at CIFILC that work there that do all the work that they do.
So I want to move us along, but I think that, you know, what will help you are some of the techniques that we're talking about here, and I think that what you've brought up is a really good example of where some help is needed to possibly rejuvenate a coalition. You know, I think that using some of these techniques that we've just talked about in this strategy session are going to be really important. We're actually going to go on to a worksheet that I think you'll see could be helpful, but it might be, you know, important for leaders in that organization to take a moment and go, okay, who's at the table, who is not at the table that needs to be, and who is the person or groups that knows both of us? And can they host a dinner party? And a dinner party, again, is an analogy. But can they host something that brings us together? So I think you bring up a really, really good point. And sometimes there are organizations or movements or mobilizations that get really big, and then they, in time, shrink down, and then they shrink, enlarge, and they get big again. So I would encourage you to use, some time to plot out using the strategy techniques in this training today to help you. So the next piece, once you've had this first meeting, this first dinner party, is you start thinking about next time. So when are we going to meet again? Or what is the next action? Or what is the next thing? And this time, you want to flip things around. This host organization or this host person has done you a favor by bringing you in contact with and in collaboration with another group. Now you want to go to them and say, how can I help you? Who do I know that you want to be in contact with? And so the next time you meet, or the next action, or the next thing that comes together, you now become the host. And the host becomes a guest. And the other guests that were there still remain guests. And then the next time, of course, it will be their opportunity to be the host. But the point of this is that reciprocal relationships are really, really important. People, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. People will remain in a relationship with you organizationally as long as they're getting a benefit out of it. And that's important because all of us who work within nonprofits or within organizations, we have to maintain, our goals, our missions. We have to get through our scope of work, and we are beholden to our funders to do that. And so we can only collaborate with other folks if we're achieving those missions and if we're working through that scope of work. So making sure that these relationships are reciprocal is important, and sharing the load in the work is very, very critical. And so on the side here, there's an image of 3 semicircles that end in an arrow, each pointing to the next semicircle. All of them together kind of snake, and they say reciprocal relationships share the load. Going on to the next slide. Okay, now here's the strategy sheet that I was just talking about. This is something I use a lot, and I think that for those folks who've been in the Disability Organizing Network, even previously when it was known as the Systems Change Network, this is a document that we've seen before in a sort of different form. I made it a little fancy looking on the slide here using a table. But the worksheet is really important. Sitting down and actually writing out who's on my team, who do I already know, who am I working with, collaborating with, who am I in relationship with, and then filling out a list of who are my desired partners, who is not at the table that I really want to be at the table, and then in the middle of them, who are our bridges or our hosts? Who are those organizations that work with both of us? That's incredibly important. I'll give you a really good example. So back in 2012, I started at CFILC working with the Systems Change Network, and then the next year it became the Disability Organizing Network in 2011. And I had come from a political and campaign background, so voting rights were really important to me. But not just voting rights, but organizing and mobilizing people to vote. And I sort of chuckle inside about that because I know a lot of folks are probably nodding their head going, yeah, voting's important, Ted. And so with my time at CFILC, I started to attend a lot of voting-related meetings, the future of California elections conferences, things like that. And what I was noticing is I was hearing that the barriers that we were experiencing to voting in the disability community were very, very similar to what people who are limited English proficient, so people who have language barriers, were experiencing in California when they go out to vote. And that all of these barriers, whether they were disability related or language related, were happening in poorer communities, communities that had less economic growth. But I didn't really know the language advocates. And I really didn't know, I knew some of the advocates that work on economic justice, but I knew them in a different frame of reference, not in voting. I knew them, oddly enough, from voting, from campaigns, but the folks I knew didn't work directly with voting systems and election advocacy. So what I did was I made a partnership and a friendship with some folks at Rock the Vote, because I knew that Rock the Vote wanted to work with us, and they wanted to work with the language people, and they wanted to work with the economic justice folks. I also made relationships with folks at the future of California elections, and started to bring in other people on those relationships. And out of that, we developed a pretty strong relationship for a period of time with the Greenlighting Institute, with NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, plus some other advocates. And when it came down to time for us to start working on making sure that the online voter registration was accessible, and then moving into working on vote centers and stuff like that, it was those relationships that made us successful, because we were all going after the same thing. And in fact, the DOnetwork partnered with Greenlighting Institute for focus groups, where we were able to demonstrate that it was the same neighborhoods. We were able to demonstrate to election officials that the same neighborhoods that were having disability access problems were having language access problems. And then that led us to working with the University of California at Davis on focus groups. So that's a really good example of how we literally sat down, and I think I sat down with both my boss, Christina Mills, and with our executive director, Teresa Fabuzzi, and went, who do we know? And then I was like, who do we want to know? And then I identified who were the folks in between. The other important piece of that, if you look at the second layer of the sheet, is in labeling this stuff, is to talk about your needs and your resources and their needs. You may not exactly know what their needs are. You may be identifying that another community is just politically strong, so it's good to have them on your side and to be working in collaboration with them. And so you may not find out what their needs are when you first fill out this worksheet. You may have to have that first meeting to sit and talk and to listen to what their needs are so that you can identify. But at least somewhere in that process, it's important for you to write a list of what your needs are. That is, the barriers you need to break, the things you want to promote, what your issues are. Get a list at some point of their needs, their barriers they want to break, their priority issues, and see where their connections are, and then make a list of the combined resources. This is really, really important, and I'm going to go back to, although we had some lively discussion on the Disability Action Coalition, I'm going to use it as an example again. Combining resources, the Disability Action Coalition has a history of really doing a good job of combining resources. For example, Disability Rights California has a full policy staff. So because of that, they were able to run the policy pieces and helping to frame what that policy was going to be in those talking points for all the folks that were going to come up to Sacramento and go meet with their legislators. CFILC puts on events a lot. So they were able to have staff that they were able to add to the logistics pieces of it. And then other groups like the unions do fundraising. The unions aren't quite so involved anymore, but they were able to help with fundraising. But the other thing that they do well is they do buses. They do rallies and protests all the time. So they were able to provide buses and transportation. So really taking a look at, now that we're working together, now that we've identified what that common issue is that we're going to work on, what are the resources that our organizations each have to offer? And that's really important for identifying that, because you don't want to do all this great planning and find out there's no money. Or you don't want to do all of this great fundraising and then find out no one knows how to spend the money in the right way. Or planning a fabulous event, but we don't have any way to get people there. So identifying those resources are going to be key to your success. So I'm going to stop here. We are going to go a little bit over the hour. So just so you know, we're entering the last section. This will move fairly quickly, but today's webinar probably will go another 15 or 20 minutes. But it's good because we've had some good discussion. But I just quickly want to stop before we go into this next section to see if anyone has any questions. And while folks are thinking about a question, if they want to unmute their phone, I'm going to read one from the chat box. This question is from Jake. So what are effective ways of engaging groups that appear not to, quote, get it, quote, unquote, about disability rights? It's a really, really good question. For example, the disability community has been telling anti-war advocates to include a protest for 20 years in the Bay Area with only some headway. So, Jacob, I love your, Jake, I love your question. This is something that I work on a lot and something I have a conversation with folks about quite frequently. One of the things is, and I think that, I'm going to just be really honest here, I think we in the disability community expect a certain level of understanding that sometimes we don't expect others to have in return. And I say that because as anyone meets another person, it's kind of like a dating relationship. What you do in a dating relationship, right, is you learn about the other person. Or becoming friends with someone, you learn about the other person. So the only way that other communities are going to learn about us is if we spend time with them. And the only way that we're going to learn about other communities is if we spend time with them as well. So the biggest example that I can really give you is I do a lot of work bringing people in DC, people with disabilities together with senior populations. There's a seniors group and a disability group that I do some stuff with and bringing them together. And one of the things that we find in the senior population is they use the H word a lot, the word handicap. And then of course it upsets all the people with disabilities. And I can go tell the seniors all day long, here's the history on the word handicap, here's what it means, that sort of stuff, people feel. But really what happens to be the most effective is when I get the two groups working together and somebody other than me tells that story to them, or they start listening to that person with the disability on the vocabulary they use, and then all of a sudden they start replicating it. So when we first start working together, Jake, things aren't going to be perfect. I'm telling you that right now. The access isn't going to be perfect. I did an event with another community where I've organized their American Sign Language for them several times, and they've gotten to watch me do it. And this time, I let them on their own do it, and for some reason, folks thought it was a concierge thing at the hotel that they ordered. And so luckily we didn't need American Sign Language, but they they kind of stepped in it by not asking for help, and they learned a big lesson. So sometimes we have to let people fall on their face a little bit, but we have to spend time with them, and we have to be understanding, and understanding that as hard as it is for us to learn other people's customs, it's going to be just as hard for them to learn our customs. So what I tend to do is I tend to start out with the easy stuff, and once they have that down, grow from there, grow from there. But the key point is to show up. It's always, always key. To show up, be there, demand our rights, demand our access, but be ready to show them how to provide our access and be ready to teach them how to provide the access as well. If we keep not showing up, then they're just not going to do it. We have to show up. We have to be there with them. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but I think that was a really great, really great question. Okay, so we're going to move along to the messaging part of this. So we've spoken and we've talked about definitions to give us a foundation. We've talked a lot about our strategy, and we've talked a lot about putting that strategy down on paper so we have something to follow. Now we want to talk about how we build our messages. Now that we have people at the table and we've done this process, we together with those people want to start developing a message that brings our grassroots into our programming, into our event, and stuff like that. So we want to start with something that's called a message triangle. And you can raise your hand here if you want. How many people have heard of a message triangle before? It's fairly common in communications. It's used quite frequently. So it looks like not a lot of hands are up. So it looks like this is new information for folks. So I'm good. I'm glad that we included it. So the message triangle is really 4 triangles put together. And on this slide, we have 4 triangles that are stacked up into one big triangle. And really the message triangle is about context. You want to know in what context your message needs to be created, and in what context does it need to be expressed. And the way that you're going to find context is through 3 things: your topic, your objective, and your audience. Context is the combination of topic, objective, and audience. So what is the issue, or what is the barrier, is your topic. How do we break this barrier is your objective. And who is the breaking of the barrier going to benefit? That's your audience. That's what's going to bring them in. So developing your key message, you want to make sure that you have 3 key points. So the reason that we stick it to 3 key points is that you want to have you want to access the capacity of folks to remember your message. It's really, really important. Any message, if I could leave you with anything today on messaging, is that your message has to be communicated in such a way that someone will repeat it. So all of us can't go out and have a conversation with 2,500 people to get 2,500 people to come to Disability Capital Action Day or to come to our Disability Pride Festival. But what we can do is if we have a message that's memorable and that people will repeat if they remember it, we can have that conversation with 100 people, and each one of them can have that conversation with 25 people. And so that's why keeping things down to 3 key points is so important. Think about the path of the message. Take people on a journey. Go back to the context in the triangle, and you talk about that, the topic, the objective, the audience. Take people on that journey. This is my barrier. This is how I break my barrier. This is how it will benefit you. So really, take people on a journey there. And then the third point in developing your message is doing your research, making sure that your facts are correct. This is so important. Making sure that you use metaphors. Metaphors are great because they're quick ways of explaining something. You can take an entire paragraph of text explanation and sometimes explain it in 3 words by using a metaphor. And then language is so important. What is your language? And even beyond language being Spanish or English or excuse me, or Korean or a different ethnic language. Language can also be older versus younger within the same language. It can be the context of the African American community to the Latino community to the disability community, but all be in English. So that's so important. And a really good example that I'll use is when I do a lot of political writing, I have to fit in people with disabilities and disabled people or disabled persons a lot. The reason is that the sort of 35 to 40 plus in age generation are really big proponents of people first language. So it's very important to them, and I want to honor that and respect it. But when it comes to youth in the disability community, they're very into disability first language. And ironically, there are some medical model stuff that plays into both as to the reasons why, but they both have different viewpoints. And we want to honor and respect younger people and the youth movement. So, I always try to make sure that I'm phrasing things in ways that appeal to both communities when I'm writing an op-ed or doing any type of messaging. So you want to use a 3-tiered messaging strategy, and this is for long-term. So if you have an event that's coming up 6 months from now, this is absolutely perfect. And the reason you want to do a 3-tiered messaging strategy is you want to play upon people's excitement as they build up towards an event. You'll see this a lot with political campaigns. But also, you want to activate their memories. Because if you're activating their memory, they're talking about your issue or you or your event to other people more and more and more. The whole point of a message is not that you get through to one person, but that person goes to their advocacy team meeting and talks about it, or that person goes to the backyard barbecue in July and talks to all their neighbors about it. And that's why it's so important, because we're utilizing other people to amplify our message throughout our communities. So the first tier is a 14-word sentence. And you're probably going, Ted, 14 words is kind of an odd number. And it is, but there was some study done many, many years ago, and it's sort of something that politicians use and political campaigns use now, that showed that people have the opportunity, or people have the availability and the capacity to remember 14 words. If you can get your message down to 14 words, they may not remember it word for word, but they're going to remember your message. So get that message, get the arc of that message, the path of the travel of it into 14 words. Then once you start hearing people repeat your 14-word message, and you know that it's catching on, so maybe 3 months down the line, or you say, oh, are you coming to such and such event? Oh yes, the event that blah 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 blah. Then you want to pare it down to 7 words, because by paring it down to 7 words, you're provoking a conversation with other people. Your message now comes down to 7 words. It's cut in half. You're using that message. You're now training people on that message. And what ends up happening is they start using that, and then it leads them to the 14-word sentence, which opens up a longer conversation with folks. So you want to use it, you want to pare it down so that it provokes the previous version, and it provokes a conversation about your issue. And then eventually, once you hear the 7 words catching on, and once you have the sense that it's caught on, you want to get down to 3 words. which is just the outcome, the ask, or the action statement. Healthcare now. You want to get to the point where if you say healthcare now, that invokes your 7-word statement, and it invokes everything that was in your 14-word statement in the conversations that you're having, or in your or in the minds of people that are watching or listening to you. We see this a lot with posters and with slogans at protests and rallies. The slogan is the 3 words. It's the thing that is chanted. It's that's the 3 words, and we want that because that's what the news will cover. But it is a quick start for people to see those 3 words, to hear those 3 words, and automatically they start thinking about the 7 words or the 14 words. So this is a very effective message strategy, and it's one that I know that I've used effectively for several years. So here's an example, and this comes from a campaign that I did back in 2004. So we're just going to take a look at what this actually looks like in reality. So our 14-word statement, this was about a year and a half out from Election Day. This was a law that we were trying to repeal in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. We were successful and we got it repealed. And the law was called Article 12. So our 14-word sentence was, Article 12 is a law that prohibits gays and lesbians from seeking protection from discrimination. Eventually, once we started to see some of those phrases and that phraseology repeated in the press, in news stories, and we heard it out of people who were coming up to our booth at different outreach events and festivals, when we would say we're here to repeal Article 12, and they started saying the sentence. Then we pared it down to 7 words, which got us an opportunity to tell more of the story by saying that Article 12 is unfair and hurts Cincinnati's families. And that was true. Because of Article 12, people were being kicked out of their apartments. They were being denied entry to a restaurant or a store, things like that. And so it had a hurtful effect on other people. And then eventually our 3 words became repeal Article 12. And I will never forget the day about 2 weeks before Election Day that one of our key volunteers was in the grocery store, and she comes in with this big handful of lots of little pieces of paper. And we were doing something that's called voter ID. It's not identification as in terms of the voter suppression law, but the other voter ID or voter identification is when you identify voters who are supportive of you and who are going to vote your way, because those are the people you want to remind to turn out and vote. And on all these little pieces of paper, she had people's names, phone numbers, email addresses, and addresses where they were registered to vote. And in the grocery store, she had a shirt on that just said, repeal Article 12. And people came up to her and said, oh my gosh, that's that law that's so unfair, that hurts families because it discriminates against LGBTQ people. I'm going to vote with you. How do I vote? Great. And then the woman knew enough to say, hey, can we get your information so that we can call you and remind you to vote? But I knew when that happened that our message had permeated a community. And that is really, really key and important, but I also think it's a really good example of how a good message can really permeate throughout a community and get around. So let's talk a little bit about our spokespersons. Our spokespersons are key and important. You got to have the right person deliver your message. And on this page, we have 3 pictures. I'm going to describe the pictures in a minute after I go through the list of spokespersons' qualities. One is you want to have someone who's universally respected. That's really, really important. That's why sometimes we get celebrities to do things. The next thing is they should be personally affected in some way. So if they're not a person with a disability, they're a person who's a parent of a person with a disability, a brother, a sister, a caregiver. But they themselves should be affected by the issue. The other thing is they need experience. So it's not just that someone is respected and affected by the issue, but they should have some sort of experience with the issue, whether it's fighting for it or against it. A good example here is that we oftentimes see spokespersons in the disability community who could be respected in their communities who are personally affected, but they're not part of the independent living movement. They may still have some hang-ups about disability, or they may still be attached to a medical model, not a social model. And we often see that message fall flat. So they were respected in their community, they were personally affected, but maybe they don't have the advocacy experience or come from the same viewpoint that we do. So they might not make a good spokesperson. So being experienced is important. And the last thing is probably the most important. They inspire confidence. And that is so incredibly important because people need confidence to act. It's not just that they, are a good speaker on the issue, that they're personally affected, that they are known with experience in the community, but they actually move the people they're speaking to act, to do something. I'm going to go back to the very first slide, take our minds back there today, that word agency. And that's so important. They're giving people the confidence to act with agency in the moment to do what needs to be done to win the battle or to win the advocacy. So on this slide here, we have 3 pictures or some examples of some folks. So we have a woman who's an African-American woman sitting in a wheelchair. We have a doctor who's in a hallway. And then we have Ellen DeGeneres, just because I decided to throw in a celebrity there. But as you can see with these images, they all connect to something in some way. And so we want to have spokespersons that make that connection. Growing the message, we talked, about the 14-7-3 strategy. When we're doing that, we also want to think in terms about who we take those messages to, and really start with your own internal, personal network. And that means there's something that I call talk to the hand. Folks have heard it before. There is a picture of a hand on this slide. And the hand is that, you have at least 5, a thumb and 4 fingers, 5 directions you can go with your message. One is you. You are the thumb. Okay, so you're going to be that spokesperson for yourself, and you're going to be that spokesperson for your issue. But also making sure that you're engaging a family member, a friend, a colleague, and a neighbor or caregiver. That's very important. So if you're not sure where to start on developing your message, start by talking to your family. Then move on to talking to your friends. Then move on to talking to your colleagues. Those could be coworkers, they could be caregivers, they could be fellow students at your school. And then talk to your neighbors and get out into the community. One of the things that we do when we do phone banks, when we're first starting campaigns, is we ask people to bring their list of friends and family, and to start, calling those people to talk about the issue or to ask them to donate or whatever we're phone banking for that night. Because, folks are going to be more comfortable starting within their own network. And there we are at the end. So I'm going to thank you all for staying with us. My contact information is on this slide if you want to follow up with me. But I also want to know if we have any questions at this time. We can have about 6 minutes that we can dedicate to questions. So please unmute your phone if you want to ask a question by pressing *6, or the mute button on your phone, or if you want to use the webinar system, just press the talk button with the microphone. And we've got a couple of questions here in the chat box, which I'm going to go ahead and read. A question, can you provide a list of partners specifically for voting? Yes, yes. So you've got my contact information on there. Please contact me. I'd be happy to. Move on to the next question. And I'm not sure if the folks who are on the handle San Joaquin County, but if anyone handles San Joaquin County, Alicia Stevens is looking for a list of partners specifically for voting. Next question. Mario says, I work with 55+ communities because I'm one of them. Awesome. I'm chasing right behind you, Mario. It took years for them to understand the services and how to fight for their rights. That's a really good comment. And I take that comment in two ways, Mario. One is that we have to have patience, and we have to understand that as we're learning about other people, we are also asking other people to learn about us. Sometimes we kind of come in and want them to be able to pass the college final on our issues and our customs, when we have to realize our first experience is going to be more K through 5th grade. But the other piece of that, too, that I take from that is that seniors are people of experience, and they have a lot of wisdom and wealth of knowledge that we can learn from them as well, especially with advocating. Another question here from Elizabeth Campbell. Going back to being inclusive with language, can you clarify and explain the difference between how youth prefer disability-first language and the older populations prefer people-first language? So I don't want to do this alone. Yolanda, are you on?
You read my mind. He said.
Okay, cool. So Yolanda, I'm going to do people first, and then can you explain disability first?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And can you speak up just a little bit more so that we can hear you?
Okay, sorry, I had the phone down because I didn't want any echoing.
That's okay. So disability first language, really came forward out of the 50s, 60s, 70s as a way to look at people and not look at the disability, because what was happening in the past, and still happens to this day, we're still fighting it, we're not completely eradicated of institutionalization and medical models, but is that society looked at the disability and they institutionalized someone because of the disability, without recognizing that there was a brain inside of there was a soul inside of there was a person inside of there who could contribute equally to their society if they just had the right support systems and the right accommodations. And a lot of that came out of the medical world as some supportive ally doctors, medical professionals, as well as people with disabilities decided to really push this people first thing to get people to see the person and not the disability. I think that was a very important step, and so that's why you have a lot of older generation folks who are very much firmly people first language folks. However, things change over time, language changes over time, and Yolanda is going to tell us the very good reasoning why youth like disability first language.
Okay, so the reason why youth tend to prefer disability first language is because, like Ted said, people started, dehumanizing people with disabilities, and so they overcompensated and started to say things like, oh, there's no such thing as a disability, it's something you can overcome with positive thinking and gumption. And so that kind of what is often called in the disability sphere as super cripping, and things like Forrest Gump being physically disabled and then just trying really hard fixed his disability. Youth tend to be like, disability is a part of me, I am not ashamed, I do not need to distance myself from. that part of my identity. I want to reclaim it as a positive part of my reality and my truth. That way people can understand that I do need accommodations and that I'm not going to perform every task as if I didn't have their type of disability. So they prefer disability first language to reclaim something that's been stigmatized.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. That was really awesome. So are there any other questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please keep an eye out for some more webinars with the DOnetwork. We are trying to schedule one on digital organizing, so using social media as an organizing tool. And then I think in the next quarter, we're working now on planning one for how to mobilize and organize with local city officials, city councils, and your county supervisors. So thanks again for joining us today. This was a little bit longer. We used to do an hour-and-a-half format. We've been doing an hour today with another hour-and-a-half, and so I want to thank you all for hanging in there. But I think the discussion was great, and really happy to have you with us today. Thank you very much.